Welcome back. All right. Watch another video that has some examples of how to address the counterclaims. Hopefully I have fixed the problem with the assignment. You should be able to see it now.
Hi, this is Mr. Sato. I'm going to explain counterarguments. When you're trying to persuade someone of something in a persuasive essay or debate, you generally want to give facts and arguments that agree with your position, of course. But to be really effective, you need to give some of the opposing side's arguments too. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but let me give you an example. In his well-known letter from Birmingham jail, this guy, you may have heard of him, responds to these 8 Alabama religious leaders who published a letter saying his actions protesting segregation were, quote, extreme, unquote. First, he argues that his protests are not extreme, but then he changes to a different tactic. He says, yes, maybe in a way, you're right, I am an extremist. At that point, you might imagine his reader thinking, wait, what? You think I'm right? But Dr. King goes on to compare himself to other extremists they will have heard of: Jesus, Amos, Paul, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, great reformers from the Bible and American history. Remember, Dr. King is a Baptist minister writing to other Judeo-Christian religious leaders, so these religious references are part of a domain that they share. He reminds these clergymen that Jesus was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness. What he did there was respond to an attack by agreeing briefly with the opponent. It makes the attacker relax his oppositional stance for a moment. And then Dr. King comes back with a devastating rebuttal that his reader couldn't possibly disagree with. It was brilliant. You may have heard of the 3 ways the ancient Greeks said you can try to persuade someone: ethos, logos, and pathos. That's a whole other topic, but briefly, logos is logical reasoning, showing cause and effect. And pathos is an appeal to emotions like pity, patriotism, or indignation. Ethos is a little harder to get a handle on, but it can be understood as credibility. Why should your reader trust you? You need to come across as a knowledgeable, reasonable, and fair-minded person, not a fanatic who only sees things in black and white terms, good and evil. That's where the counter-argument or counterclaim comes in. By showing that you understand what this issue looks like from where your opponents are standing, you disarm them. You come over to your opponent's side for a moment and show yourself to be open-minded and fair. You admit that your opponents have a reasonable position and you can understand why they think what they do. But your argument is just more right than theirs, and you forcefully explain why. That's a rebuttal. Look at this question. So let's say your position is that violent video games do not cause young people to be more violent. Your reader or opponent is going to say that they do, and your job is to convince that person to agree with you. First, you're going to thoroughly research the issue and line up your most persuasive arguments. You're going to point out that sales of violent video games are up, but that violent crime by young people is actually down 37%. And if the games were causing violence, then wouldn't the violent crimes go up when the sales of the violent games went up? You're also going to cite the 2011 US Supreme Court decision in which the court rejected arguments that the games caused minors to act violently. And you'll continue with more evidence and arguments that support your position. But at some point in your arguments, not in the first paragraph or the conclusion, I think, you should talk about your opponent's most persuasive argument. You're anticipating your reader's objections and addressing them. That's the counter-argument. Do your research. What is the opposition's most persuasive argument? Where are you vulnerable? Don't choose an easy one because it's easy to knock down. That's called a straw man. See, it'd be easy to knock this right over. Choose one that could actually hurt your position. Let's say that you think the most damaging argument the opposition has is that a lot of qualified people think that violent video games cause aggression in children. 90% of pediatricians believe that. 67% of parents think so too. And maybe most persuasively, and I got this from procon.org, a joint statement was put out by 6 national medical associations, including the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association. And it said, quote, well over 1,000 studies, including reports from the Surgeon General's office, the National Institute of Mental Health, and numerous studies conducted by leading figures within our medical and public health organizations, point overwhelmingly to a causal connection between media violence and aggressive behavior in some children. That one could hurt you, right? If you were arguing the other side, you'd use that, wouldn't you? I would. Don't avoid that argument. Doing so leaves you defenseless to it. Cite that argument yourself. Put it out there. And I'm not talking about a single sentence either. Explain it fully and fairly. But then, respond to it in a way that is favorable to your argument. If you can contradict that or show a flaw in it, then do so. That's your rebuttal. You might say that there are equally valid reports showing the opposite, and then cite those studies. Not only that, a report by a Dr. Ferguson of Stetson University showed that many of those studies don't really reflect the way the games are played in real life. And the ways that test subjects showed aggression are artificial measures that, again, are not a reflection of real life behavior. And then you go into great and persuasive detail to show that those flawed studies aren't worth the paper they're printed on. A rebuttal takes your opponent's best argument away from them, and it invites them to come on over to your side to consider your position as well. If you can't contradict, though, just give them that point. That's called a concession. It's like saying, okay, I'll give you that one. And then you undermine it as best you can. You try to weaken it. You might say, yes, there may be some causal connection with some children between the games and violence, but there are other kinds of things that can cause aggressive behavior, so maybe we should look at this in that larger context. Then you have a long list of other things that are cited as possible causes of violent behavior. People used to say that heavy metal and rap music incited violence. Maybe you can find an article saying that watching contact sports on TV is connected to aggression too, or an article saying that caffeine is linked to aggression. You could point out that people are using your opponent's arguments to ban violent video games, and should we next try to ban rap music, football, and coffee? Okay, notice how I changed the subject there. When you concede a point, you could try this. You could try redirecting the discussion to an area where you have an advantage of some kind. Last, let's talk about transitions. You probably already know a thing or two about paragraph transitions. If not, check out my other video on that topic. But before giving your reader your counter argument, you have to indicate that you're about to do that, so that your reader is following your reasoning without getting confused. So you can use a transition like one of these. For example, you could say, people who say violent video games cause violence in real life might point out that, or while it's true that a joint statement by 6 leading medical associations said, or granted, there is some evidence suggesting a connection between violent video games and violent behavior.
If you don't have one of these transitions, then it suddenly looks like you shifted to arguing the other side and that you're contradicting your thesis. So you have to be clear when you start addressing the counter argument that you're doing that by saying opponents of violent video games say this, you know, and make it clear that it's not your position and not your view, by using the transitions. So the opposition might say, granted, this is true, nevertheless, however, otherwise it can sound like you're arguing for them. You don't want to sound like you're arguing for them. You're just bringing them into the argument so you can address their concerns. Okay?
And then you give your counter argument. And then after that, your rebuttal could be preceded with another transition, like, so while it's true that some children are affected by some video games, it's equally true that, or nevertheless, or nobody denies that some kids might behave violently after 8 hours of Mortal Kombat, but, and then you give your rebuttal. Using a counter argument and rebuttal is a way of showing that you have come to your position after giving a balanced analysis of both sides. And that's more persuasive than just ranting from a single perspective. There's already too much of that in the world. Just look at the comment sections to videos and articles on the internet, and you'll see what one-sided argumentation looks like. And those arguments are easily dismissed, right? So don't be like them. If you want to be persuasive, come across as fair and reasonable. And the best way to do this is by using counter arguments. Okay, now go get them.
Yeah, good question, Alexa. You do not need the works cited for the first draft of the paper. I asked for it for the second draft. Oh, and those instructions about bringing a hard copy are old, obviously, for when we were in the classroom. So for this first draft, you don't have to have your works cited finished, okay? I would like it for the second draft that is due on Monday, so that if you have questions about how to format something, that I can help you out with those before the final draft is due. Okay. So aim for having your works cited finished by the second draft. Now you'll notice we're doing an additional draft for this paper. So you turn in the first draft, I read it, we conference. You continue while you're waiting to conference with me, taking in the peer review comments that you get from people on Wednesday. Okay. So keep working using their comments to help you flesh it out. And then you'll use my comments and develop your second draft. And then your final draft eventually. So does everybody understand the need to present the other side's argument clearly and then clearly either refute it or acknowledge it? He called it conceding it. Okay. Or you can call it rebutting it if you're disagreeing with it. Those are all the same thing. But make sure you introduce the fact that you're now bringing the opposition in. So use transitions to signal you are bringing in the opposing viewpoint.
When he was mentioning using like a different argument to help like he mentioned like using a completely different argument, is that something you recommend doing?
I don't really recommend doing that, and I'm glad you brought it up. That's a little bit like straw man. So we're going to talk about a few logical fallacies. And straw man is where you don't really address the argument you're making, but like he said, you try to change the topic. But really, I think that weakens your argument. Go ahead.
I feel like it would make the paper messy. Like, I'm not sure how I'd organize that without getting too off topic.
Yeah, I don't agree with that part of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Because a straw man argument is when you don't really address the argument that's being made. You address an extreme form of it in some cases. So as an example, right now, some people are saying we have to do something more about controlling coronavirus in the United States. And so some of the opposition response is, well, we can't just lock down the entire country and throw all the businesses out, work and, basically hide in our basements, right? These are not the only two options, okay? People who are saying we need to do something to control coronavirus are not saying a lockdown is the only method. So basically you're taking the most extreme form of that argument and acting like it's the only argument they're making on the other side. Okay? The other side might be arguing for masks or social distancing or something else, But if you take the least popular sort of solution and argue against it, then people tend to forget there are other options out there. So I really think his suggestion's a little bit, you know, cagey. I'd stick with just arguing the facts and say that, you know, something like maybe the research is out of date, or like I like what he was saying about looking at the studies and looking at problems with them, or that the benefits of playing video games. Some people have had some good research in their last paper about how the benefits can outweigh the potential disadvantages for some kids. Okay. They can increase skills, mental acuity, observation, things like that. That is an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it. I would stick to the topic rather than bringing in, you know, far-flung other issues. All right, does everybody have kind of an idea of what you need to do to address the opposition? So what you can do for Wednesday is take the arguments that are on your side and start adding more evidence. And then take the opposition arguments and start either acknowledging or refuting them, right? Okay. The more evidence you can provide to support each of your points, the better off we will be. Like I said, I'm trying to get the papers where you presented both sides graded by Tuesday, so everybody can see it. So I've got it about halfway through them right now. So you may want to check if you haven't already to see if I already have comments on yours. Just so you know if there's something that you still need to do to explain your background or be clear about a position, that you can do that, kind of tweak it. All right, everybody know what to do for the developing the next draft for Wednesday? I want to talk about some more common logical fallacies. Go ahead.
4 or 6 pages? I'm sorry.
You're looking for 6-page draft for Wednesday.
Got it.
Incarnate stuff.
Okay, so far in terms of logical fallacies, we've talked about ad populum, which is basically appealing to the masses. Everybody's doing it, so you should do it too. There's no logic to that argument. Just because a lot of people are doing something does not make it the correct thing to do. But that's the only argument they're using. I want to talk about another popular one, and I think I mentioned this also briefly on Wednesday, which is hasty generalization. And this is when you make a big conclusion from a very small pool of evidence. Stereotypes are often based on this. So let's look at this video that kind of goes into what a hasty generalization is, because it's a pretty common logical fallacy, bad argument that's used in our society. Let me share my screen here.
Or today we're going to be continuing with fallacies of weak induction, looking at the fallacy of hasty generalization. So hasty generalization is using an unrepresentative sample to conclude a general rule, or taking a small or non-random sample to make conclusions about a population. This is really common when you see stereotypes. Those are a great example of this. And it's the opposite of the fallacy of accident, because the fallacy of accident uses a general rule and applies it to a uncommon case, Well, this takes an uncommon case and tries to make a general rule out of it. Let's take a look at some examples. So I just saw a black person mug someone, therefore all black people are thieves. It should be really clear why this is fallacious. I opened a can of pop and it exploded everywhere, therefore all cans of soda will explode when opened. Islamic fundamentalists crash planes in the World Trade Center, therefore all people that believe in Islam are violent. With all of these arguments, there is something going on that makes the case that the person observed different or special that doesn't allow it to be applied to a general rule. Unless you have a lovely, randomly selected and large enough sample size, you shouldn't be concluding general rules out of anything. That was hasty generalization. Also today, we're going to be looking at indirect proof, part 2. Yesterday, we looked at appeal to ignorance and indirect proof, part 1. And tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the fallacy of false cause and the answers.
Okay. Lizzie, you are building off the information in your old paper. So you're taking the research you've done that investigated both sides of the controversy, and now you're taking a position on that controversy, defending it and addressing the opposition. You're persuading us to agree with you. A couple things I'm seeing in the drafts just to warn everybody about. Make sure you review academic style. I'm still seeing a lot of casual language. I'm still seeing cliches. I'm still seeing a lot of contractions. So remember, the rules for writing research papers mean it's more formal, no contractions, no personal pronouns. Do not include your personal experiences as evidence. It is a research paper, therefore anything that happened to you personally cannot constitute evidence, or you're doing a hasty generalization. You guys follow me? And that hurts your ethos. It is bad for your ethos. Another bad thing that it does for your ethos is we assume that you had bias going into the research. So you didn't just go and keep an open mind when you did your research. You already had a preconceived notion, and you may have sought evidence to confirm that notion. So perhaps I had a lovely student who was doing a paper on child support and how the laws are not effective, and ended up including personal experiences in it, and that immediately lost her credibility ethos because she was unable to be objective about looking at the evidence. And then we knew she wasn't objective because she included her personal experience. Are you guys following me? If we know you have experience, then we're going to suspect your research methods. And it shouldn't be based on your experience. It should be based on research because it is a research paper, right? So hasty generalization. Let's look at the straw man, which we've already been talking about and which several of the videos have talked about.
Straw man's like the most annoying thing.
Straw man's like what?
Straw man can be like the most annoying thing ever to deal with.
Yes, because basically go ahead, tell me why it's annoying.
Because you're just dealing with an argument that essentially doesn't even exist.
Right.
Pretty much what it is.
Yeah, they're not arguing with you at all. Instead, they are basically arguing what they want against what they want to argue against that's easy to knock down. 1 second. Let me get rid of this commercial. Okay, so let's look at an example of what a straw man argument might be. All right, can you guys see the video? Hopefully you can.
I can see it. I can see it.
We can see
Yeah, we
it.
can see it.
All right, here we
A
go.
link to this video because someone is concerned that you might not be arguing your case to your utmost ability. They're concerned you might have used a fallacy to make an important point, thus defeating your own claim. The fallacy they're concerned you might have used is the straw man fallacy. Contrary to what many people would have us believe, a straw man is not simply an argument that you dislike or find inconvenient. Rather, it is a version of an argument that is misrepresented, simplified, so that it is easier to knock over. Just as an actual man made of straw is a less solid version of a man made of flesh, a straw man argument is a less solid version of a fully fleshed out argument. A straw man replaces or represents whatever actual argument is being made. Straw manning can come in many different forms. It's not even always intentional. You might accidentally construct a straw man if you don't fully understand the depth of an argument. And that is fine. It happens to the best of us. However, to intentionally misread or misrepresent an argument to simplify the process of discrediting it, that's a little bit less forgivable. To take nuanced points out of context, to ignore crucial information, to even exaggerate claims to the point of absurdity, which is then easier to refute. These are all straw man tactics. For example, Mike and Straw Mike are having the conversation about how to responsibly depict awful stuff in media. I don't think it's too much to ask that when a media creator wants to show heinous or awful stuff, they do so in a context that shows that that stuff is heinous and awful. Oh, so now we're not allowed to show violent or terrible things unless we include some long-winded sermon about how bad things are bad? I think creators should be able to show or do whatever they want. The original argument states a preference for what Mike thinks constitutes the responsible use of media. The straw man argument recasts this as something much simpler and easier to agree with. Freedom is good, censorship is bad. But now Mike and Straw Mike are no longer arguing about the same point. And so the conversation will quickly become unfocused and aggressive, which is never fun. If you're going to win an argument, you want to win against what the other side actually thinks, don't you? A straw man argument keeps that from happening. I hope this description of the straw man fallacy has been helpful.
Okay. Hi, Orlando. Yeah, it's December the 1st. So the straw man basically means somebody argues with you, and instead of addressing what they're saying in their specific argument, you take something that's like an extreme version of what they're saying. So for example, climate change. I see a lot of straw man arguments for this. Let's say you are arguing we need to do things to mitigate climate change. We need to take actions to protect the environment. Okay. So take a look on the internet and see if you can see any straw man arguments that address the extreme of this instead of what actual action we might be able to take. They distort it, basically. So they may, when they say we need to do, some things that will keep our air clean and our water clean, and instead, what does the other side argue? Anybody heard any examples? See what they're saying on the internet. If you find something, post it in the chat. All right. There's one example recently when they were debating it in Congress of somebody who is bringing in arguments against the Green New Deal. Whether or not you believe in it, you just have to argue what the actual deal says as opposed to what you are distorting it as saying. So hold on a second, I'll share this. So this is his response.
This is, of course, a picture of former President Ronald Reagan, a machine gun while riding on the back of a dinosaur. You'll notice a couple of important features here. First of all, the rocket launcher strapped to President Reagan's back, and then the stirring, unmistakable patriotism of the Velociraptor holding up a tattered American flag, a symbol of all it means to be an American. This is, of course, a picture of former President Ronald Reagan.
Okay, so his basic argument is that this picture was as relevant to the Cold War as he believes the proposed Green New Deal is to solving climate change. Okay, so does he deal with whatever the Green New Deal is proposing? No, he does not. He just brings in this, you know, comical poster of Reagan riding a dinosaur with an American flag in his hand, and say to, I guess, draw a parallel of how he believes it's so ridiculous and out of touch, I guess. But he doesn't really address any of the parts of the deal that he disagrees with, that he might have legitimate problems with that could, you know, cause people to be persuaded, right? So instead of dealing with the real provisions of the deal, he's just making hyperbolic claims. It's entertaining, right? He's going for the entertainment value over substance. But basically, when you don't really address the argument that they're using and using, you know, address the extreme. So if we do the Green New Deal, they're going to take away all of our cars. Okay. If we pass background checks for weapons, they're going to take away all of our guns. You know, so we can't do that, or the extreme thing will happen. That's also known as a version of slippery slope. If we take one step towards something, if we allow cloning, then soon people will be cloning everyone and everything, and we won't know who's real and who's a clone, and you know, people get hysterical when they do a straw man. Jason?
No, I was just gonna say that I was gonna give another example. Like if I give my kid like $20 a month, then they'll steal from my credit card when they're like 20. I don't know. Like I think that's an example of slippery slope. Another one.
Yeah, if you take one step towards something, then the worst, you know, they use that argument. We went to war in Vietnam, partially because the argument was if Vietnam fell to communism, then so would the rest of Southeast Asia. So if Vietnam becomes a communist nation, then all the other nations around Vietnam will follow. So we have to get in there in Vietnam and stop it from becoming communist. Okay, that was a slippery slope argument. And it got us into a war. So sometimes if people don't pay attention, you know, so if you see someone like addressing just the extreme form of the argument, it's usually a straw man form of the argument. Okay. Now you're going to have to tell me about many of these logical fallacies on the final exam. So make sure we're going to talk about more of them on Wednesday. There's just so many of them, unfortunately. I'm trying to go over the most common ones. You'll see a lot of hasty generalization, a lot of bandwagon. I'm going to end this session now and we'll come back briefly and I'm going to cover one more fallacy and then I'm going to see if anybody has any questions. Okay. I'll see you back here in a minute.